In this video, I'll lay out a few considerations and parameters that are keeping you from your goals. There are many things that I had to learn the hard way that were never mentioned by the health or fitness industry. And by the end of the video, you'll have a host of things you can experiment with and that you should consider. I'll highlight several factors that has had a huge impact on my physique as I struggle to make sense of things for myself. And I'll highlight each and one of these points with my own experiences as we go further down the video. So bio-individuality is a major component, and that's in whatever it is, your health or your fitness. And if that's of course it's gonna play a role in getting to your desired physique, right? So why this isn't mentioned much is because it's a hard sell in the fitness industry. Like if I can't scale anything and I can't create this like prefabricated templates and sell you a one size fits all product, that means I'm losing money, right? I mean, obviously this isn't the case for everything or everyone. It's just the case for what the industry is now based in, is selling as much product as possible, right? Even in the health industry, it's become the same thing. So it's the starting assumption then is that we're all the same, and assumptions are the mother of all fuck ups. So this goes far beyond genetics, which is what most people would grab onto as their excuse as to why they're not getting fit. Genetics, of course, play a role, but epigenetics have far more to say in general about your path to fitness and health than all the other things you could think of. Meaning that, like, of course, there are things that are set, the color of your eyes, your height and stuff like that when you've reached a certain age, right? So there are a set of genetics that you can't really do anything about, but that's generally not the problem. The problem persists, or the issues and the challenges persist with the epigenetics, and that there's things that aren't being done that would change these epigenetic switches, right? So there's a lot of leeway and margins to work in. And everything that I will mention as we go through the video is interconnected, and it influences and informs, or they influence and inform each other. The first one is gut health. So this is a combination of several things, because the gut, I mean, even though we're starting to learn more about it now, it's still quite complex, right? So it's a combination of a lot of different things as to what constitutes as gut health, which is gut bacteria, your gut lining, the integrity of the gut lining, fungi, yeast, parasites, viruses, and how all of those work together, right? So what I would call symbiosis, and when they're not working together properly, or there are other issues, then this would be dysbiosis, and this would manifest itself as food allergies, food intolerances, and all the adverse reactions when you're eating. So low-grade inflammation, bloating, stomach distension. So these are all things that have to do with the state of the gut, right? And it's actually the entire digestive process that has everything to say about this. But if we're just looking at the gut right now, there's a lot of things in there all on its own that should be running optimally, right? So this is one of the major elements of bio-individuality is found in the gut, and that's also why there's no one size fits all plan or diet, right? And that's also one of the main reasons why following someone else's protocol is unwise, because their gut is not your gut. And that's something that I fell into quite often, where I was like, oh, what are they eating? What are they doing? And I'll do that. And there's a lot of things that I've tried that never really worked, and things didn't really start changing until I did what worked for me, right? So that's why it's good when you're looking for information. So I'm not discounting that or dismissing that or trying to discourage you from doing that, but it's more that you want to experiment with your nutrition in a way that is coherent with the state of your gut. Initially, your gut bacteria come from your mother, right? So the way you've been delivered into the world, and then the rest is built up throughout the childhood into, well, whatever you get exposed to, animals, your environment, right? So everyone, everything and everyone, which is really important because like that's why you want kids to, be outside and be exposed to things. There's also, of course, like the same thing, like it's a double-edged blade because whatever you're exposed to that isn't so great, antibiotics, environmental toxins, like plastics and stuff, that then they would contribute to gut dysbiosis. So then the gut will also constantly change according to the foods you eat, which is another extension of your environment, but also your exposure to sunlight, the amount of stress you experience, and what I said before, the toxins in the environment. So a good illustration of the impact of a healthy gut versus a non-healthy gut is fecal transplants from lean mice into obese mice. And when they took the fecal matter, which is poop of the mouse, and put it in an obese mouse, then that obese mouse would start getting leaner and eventually gets lean. And they also observed the opposite effect, which is like from an obese mouse into a lean mouse, that lean mouse would get obese, right? So there's a lot in gut bacteria and gut health that we don't know yet, but these are all good indicators that gut bacteria and gut bacteria function and everything that has to do with it, because that's just one parameter, right? So we haven't talked about like viruses and parasites and fungi and things like that because there's very little knowledge around that. I mean, there is some, but it's still in its infancy. So the point here is that you want to work on your gut health, or rather eat in a way that is congruent with your gut bacteria. And if there are issues in the gut, whether it's like SIBO, which is a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or certain bacterial infections, yeast infections, or maybe some issues with fungi and even some viruses, then that's the type of thing that should get sorted first. The second one is inflammation. So too much inflammation would basically throw a wrench into the entire process of hormonal synthesis, hormonal regulation, and basically anything else. When you think about creating neurotransmitters, creating hormones, getting enough micronutrients, all of that, right? So this is something that anyone with autoimmunity can attest to, or if you're having gut issues or prolonged gut issues, or never really got past a certain sticking point with losing fat or even gaining muscle, right? This can be attributed in a large part to inflammation. So there's a certain threshold that everyone has, again, in a bio-individual way, as to how much inflammation you can deal with, and that largely has to do with how strong the gut is in your immune system. So the closer one is to autoimmunity, on a spectrum, right? The less rather you can get away with when it comes to inflammation and anything that would cause inflammation, right? So the foods that you eat. So the gut lining is supposed to stop most of these things from passing into the bloodstream of the things that you eat that are causing inflammation. But when the gut lining, right, as we saw in the first point, isn't very strong, then, or not only isn't very strong, if it's compromised, let's say, because it's less about strength and more about like junctions, right? So it's called a tight junction if it starts getting opened up more because of the damage done to the gut, then it will go through the gut lining, right? So there's a mucus layer, and then there's the cell wall, that is the gut lining, and then those two things are supposed to stop foreign pathogens from entering into the bloodstream and thus activating the immune system. So when that part of the whole process is compromised, right? So it's the initial barrier between you and the outside world. Then the next thing that needs to work is the liver, right? So it also houses a big part of the immune system, and it does a lot of the endogenous, so the built-in mechanic of detoxing, or rather systems of detoxification. And when it's able to clear up these toxins in the bloodstream, inflammation would go down, right? So, but if the liver is impaired, then the next system in line is the lymphatic system, which is like a fluid system going that is all over our body underneath our skin, that will take up toxins and minerals, so like micronutrients, and it will try to get them out of the bloodstream, right? And it will, well, eventually try to get them out of the body, right? So it's, think of it like a transport network. So if that system is overburdened, then, or yeah, mainly overburdened, then certain lymph nodes will start getting inflamed as well, because the body can't get rid of all the toxic buildup or all the waste that you're building. So if the lymph nodes get inflamed, they're also inhibiting muscle, because there's a tight junction between these as well. Like there's connections between your lymph nodes and your muscle tissue, which means that if I'm constantly inflamed, so as you start seeing the connection through each of these systems, then the amount of muscle that I can activate or build is compromised, right? So it makes it much harder to tap into these muscle groups, or just a muscle, when there's inflammation present, or specifically in certain lymph nodes that would compromise or deactivate to a certain degree, or rather like change your communication level to these muscle groups, right? So this is kind of summed up as the gut muscle axis, because of the way the gut directly and indirectly influences how muscle response, right? So it's between the gut and the muscle tissue itself, and that has to do everything of muscle protein synthesis, so building muscle from the fibers. Mitochondrial biogenesis, which means making new mitochondria. And the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and even muscle glycogen storage, so the amount of glucose I can store in my muscles. The next element to this is stress. So that's our third factor or parameter. So stress is a huge factor in hormonal profiles and everything that has to do with hormones and then moods, and so how you feel. So one of the major pathways that does this is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, short for HPA axis. And it's kind of like a master control pathway when it comes to dealing with stress. So for the majority, stress will come from work or relationships. So it's everything that goes on in life, right? And it's a combination of all of these things. So for some others, there's also elements of childhood trauma or adolescent trauma, or maybe even trauma in adulthood, right? Because when we think about what trauma is a response to a stress level that's above your threshold to be able to cope with it, right? So anything you can't really cope with is in that sense traumatic, because if I don't have the means to cope it, then it's beyond that threshold, then your body is gonna go into these protective modes in order to try to work with that, or rather it's less working and more safeguarding you from this stress, right? So if stress is running rampant, it's gonna change the gut microbiome, it's gonna create inflammation, and it's gonna basically ask for a lot more of the energy, so the resources that your body's getting, whether it's food or anything else, right? And even sleep, to use that in order to mitigate stress or to deal with the stress that you're experiencing. So for men, it's also smart to pay attention to the APG axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gonad axis, which plays a pretty important part in the production of testosterone, but also the conversion of testosterone into cortisol. So cortisol is a stress hormone, which in and of itself isn't bad, right? Because we want to have a cortisol spike in the morning to wake up. It's just that we don't really want that to be elevated for prolonged periods of time, right? Because of the impact that it has on the just body as a whole, right? And your moods, and how this is a bidirectional relationship with stress. So we kind of already tackled nutrition, but the fourth element here would be nutrition and environmental toxins. So I know I talked about this already sort of in the gut section, but I wanted to emphasize a little bit more things in nutrition that are playing a factor or are a factor into as to why you're not losing fat or not building muscle or even making headway in your health, right? So eating foods that you're intolerant to is a surefire way to increase your systemic inflammation, which is like low-grade system-wide inflammation, and keeping your gut into dysbiosis, right? So the idea here of what is healthy for you is largely based on your gut, right? So a good example of this is anti-nutrients, which is the compounds in the plants that have negative effects on the human health, which you can find in a lot of different plants. So there's a plant toxicity spectrum, and the more, as I kind of relayed in the first part, the more sensitive your gut is, or the more it goes towards that like autoimmunity part of the spectrum, the less of these types of things it can tolerate, right? So that's when you're eating foods that you might think are healthy for you but are actually not healthy for you because of the state of your gut, then that's one of the things that is obviously gonna be an anchor for you and your progress. As I kind of listed before, like the worst offenders would be mold toxicity, yeast infection, SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, parasites, environmental toxins, because they all damage the gut lining and they change the balance of the bacteria in your gut, right? And can cause a lot more havoc into the like little tendrils that hang from the gut wall, your villi, as what they're called. Right, so another big offender is alcohol, which is quite damaging to the gut, right? So from negative gram bacteria and it being an endotoxin, endo means gut, right? You don't know what a toxin is, which is probably why the popular phrase in Westerns is pick your poison, right? And if it's an endotoxin, it also serves as a neurotoxin. So there's a lot around that to consider. If it's not just about the food itself, then there's also different elements, as in eating too little food, right? So then there's a mismatch between energy prediction, what my body predicts it needs. Like, okay, let's say if I'm more stressed, my energy prediction goes up, and so does my energy demand, right? So if my intake never matches that demand, then there's gonna be signals from the body that are gonna try to find a way to regulate the body, without its getting the food that it needs, right? So you see this in a lot of people, that if they eat too little for a long period of time, there's a lot of hormonal disruption that will happen, and even fat gain despite being in a caloric deficit, because of the stress it's putting on your body to be in a prolonged caloric deficit the whole time, right? So that's just one example. So this hormonal disruption, it basically stops metabolic tissues from doing what they would be doing naturally, and it will keep you fat or it will stop you from gaining muscle, right? Or both. So another relevant factor is eating too little protein, right? So not all quality of protein is the same to begin with. It's very different from animal-based protein compared to plant-based protein, as animal-based protein is a whole source of amino, so like the amino acid profile is complete, whereas most plant proteins are not. And if I'm doing heavy strength training and I have an active schedule, or I'm competing as an athlete, then my protein intake should be high enough that allows for me to recover and to fuel my activities, right? So it's the protein demand is pretty important in general. Be too few micronutrients, right? It's very easily overlooked because a lot of the industry, whether fitness or health, deals with tracking macronutrients, which is protein, fats, and carbohydrates, right? But if there's gut dysbiosis, that means that your ability to create hormones out of these micronutrients is compromised. But it also could mean that just whatever you're ingesting of micronutrients, because of the way the gut is inflamed, which stop those micronutrients from being absorbed, or even that the bacteria are taking up more of the micronutrients than they should because of certain imbalances in the gut. So that's also an important thing to think about. And also when it comes to the micronutrient profile, again, there's a pretty big difference between bioavailability from animal-based micronutrients compared to plant micronutrients, right? Because they have to go through a conversion process, which is a metabolic pathway. And thus, if you're in the category of people, or just in general, that don't do well on the plants, it's probably because you're not converting these precursors to the micronutrients that you need. The fifth segment is sleep. So sleep really is our only time of deep recovery and repair. So we still have the ability to do some repair and some recovery whilst we're awake, but most of it takes place when we're sleeping. When we're talking about inflammation, that's a really good illustration of this. So your lymphatic system is the lymphatic system in the brain, which has a part of it is the cerebral, so the cerebral spinal fluid that will come into the brain and help pump the toxins out through the lymphatic system, right? And these toxins could be whatever we've been exposed to, and of course the waste that we produce by running our cells, right? So the other factor when it comes to muscle building is human growth hormone, which is the highest of its release when we are sleeping, right? So that's a really important element to it. And the other really important element is that all your metabolic tissues and half of your genetics are chrono-related. So in chronobiology, the term for the biology that's linked to circadian rhythms, which is day and night cycles. So all my metabolic tissue, meaning like my fat, my muscle, my liver, and my organs, they all have these genetics. So if there's issues in sleep, you're going to see that these genetic epigenetic switches are being turned on or off, right, for worse or for better. So if my sleep is poor, you're going to see epigenetic regulation in these metabolic tissues that is going to, well, put a brake on your gains, to put it simply. So they would make you more glucose, so insulin resistance. They would make you more, after a prolonged time, of course, they would, or we could actually see that as data shown from even 1 night of sleep deprivation. And they would down-regulate all of these different processes, whether it's in the liver, whether it's in muscle, whether it's in fat, right? So one of the major takeaways you want to think about is your sleep, and in modern day society, it's also one of the first things to go, right? So when we feel like when we lack time, generally we'll start cutting into our sleeps to make up for whatever time we feel like we're losing, right? So sleep is a huge factor when it comes to why you can't get fit. The sixth one is the state of the organ. So we've touched upon this in various of these segments or of these parameters, right? So the liver, for instance. So your organs have a really big say in your ability to get leaner, build more muscle, and of course be healthier in general, because it's based on their function, right? They're all important. It's not like that, like, oh, this is the most important organ in the body. It's like we would all want them to do what they're supposed to be doing at the optimal level we would require from them, right? But for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to focus on a few things, right? So the liver has come up before, but it's also, the liver creates insulin growth factor 1, which it helps us build muscle, which is kind of important, right? So when we think about that, like impairing our livers with too much alcohol or alcohol in general, too much stimulants, too much processed foods, or too much food in general, if you're constantly overeating, right? Those are all stressors on the liver that could impede liver function and, well, general toxicity in the body, right? So if my immune system is constantly active, if I am exposed to things like mold or environmental toxins, that would stress the liver If I'm not sleeping well, that will change the epigenetics in the liver, making it more susceptible to things or slowly degrading. Next to the gut, I would say that the liver is probably the most damaged organ in modern people's bodies, right? And any reduction of liver function is going to impede on your ability to lose fat and gain muscle and be healthier overall, right? And of course, like that's a major component of what we're looking for here. And another organ I like to highlight is the thyroid, which is a hormone regulator and it creates hormones, right? So the thyroid issues will definitely stand in the way of your ability to gain fat and lose muscle and again be healthier overall, because that's technically what we're looking for. Like if you become healthier, then muscle gain and fat loss will come because of your health improving, right? So it's pretty important that the thyroid, again, like it has to do with stress, it has to do with what you're eating. It's tied to all of these other things that I've said before. Another important thing is that you need to have enough cholesterol to create sex hormones, right? So having a low cholesterol, even though that's propagated as the end-all be-all of cardiovascular health, let's say, it's really not. Of course, there's a nuance here that's pretty important, but hormones and sex hormones are created out of cholesterol. A lower cholesterol isn't necessarily a good thing. A lot of it has to do with cholesterol is being oxidized or not. So if there's a higher cholesterol in and of itself doesn't mean anything if there's very low levels of inflammation in the body and your cholesterol isn't oxidizing, right? So that's an important factor here. So these are a few things around organs that I think are key takeaways that you might want to consider as to looking into or why you're not losing weight or why you're not building muscle. I'd say the last element is time and consistency. I know that a lot of people understand that things do take time and that being consistent is important, but I don't think it's really emphasized enough or defined or made precise enough to the degree that makes people understand why they need to be consistent and how much time things take, right? So when we think about just from the perspective of fat as a fat percentage, right? So fat comes with its own set point. So if I'm at 15% and I've been there for quite some time, my body will want to stay around 15% because that's what it used to. The body wants to have efficiency, so it's gonna set certain margins around this body fat percentage and then we'll try to keep you there. Why this is important is because your fat set point doesn't just change overnight and it doesn't even change after 3 months. Even though you would see a lot of good results can be made in 3 months, which is evidence of these transformations used by the fitness industry, which is also their biggest sell when you think about it. Like there's a reason why a lot of programs are 12 weeks and like 90% of the industry is based around that paradigm of like, oh, the 12-week transformation, because you can do a lot in 3 months. But the one thing that doesn't really happen, or it really just doesn't, is that the fat set point doesn't change after 3 months. You would have to stay at that fat percentage, your new fat percentage, for a very long time, or a very long time anyway in the modern perception, which is around a year. And it's only as I start being in that fat percentage longer, so let's say I went from 15 to 10, and I stay for 10% at a year, then that 10% becomes more and more reinforced by the body as the set point. So the longer I stay into a set point, the more it becomes ingrained and enforced, which is a really important point. And as to what you can see with a lot of these transformations, not all, but the majority, is that they just kind of eventually bounce back to their original set point, right? So that's why when we think about all of these things, it's more of like a lifestyle thing if I want to lose fat and build muscle, rather than this is just something I want to do for 12 weeks. And why I emphasize health so many times throughout the other parameters, because eventually you want your muscle loss and fat gain to be an extension of you getting healthier. And thinking about this from a longevity standpoint or perspective of something you're going to be doing for quite some time, because I'm assuming everyone wants to be healthy their entire life through. Consistency is far more than just training or than just eating in and of itself. So like there's the industry thinking again, that is about the 80-20 rule. And you want to be mindful of like 80-20 again is bound by nuance and context, because if I'm intolerant to some things, certain foods, but I'm eating in my 80-20, but I'm still getting inflamed 20% of the time, then I'm still damaging my gut lining, and everything takes so much longer to heal, or it takes so much longer to build muscle and lose fat, because I'm constantly or reopening that wound, if you will, right? So inflammation is part of the healing process. If I'm eating things in moderation, right, which is again, it's the same thing as the 80-20. It's like moderation for whom? Like, what's my moderation of certain foods I can tolerate, so the amounts is not yours, right? Which goes back to all the way to the first parameter that I said about gut and the bio-individuality around there. So your consistency with food will look very different than someone else's consistency, because all of these things are based on your own individuality or bio-individuality. So it's far more complex and nuanced than just saying, oh, like you can have a cheat meal or just do 80-20. It's less about what we think it will take, like cognitively, and more about the parameters of the body that will dictate what it takes for us to get healthier and then lose fat and build muscle in the process. So each time my body fat has fluctuated, it's been because of all of these parameters put together that that have had everything to say about my ability to lose fat and gain muscle. So if we're looking at these pictures, when I started losing fat, which was 16 kilos, which was around 35 pounds in 6 months, then you can see like there was really no muscle gain there. And as far as what worked, it's the standard of losing weight. I cut out a lot of the processed foods that I was eating, that were really unhealthy, and I started focusing on whole foods, and I started running some stairs. I started running stairs 30 minutes every day, which allowed me to lose weight. But when we think about like, if we look at the next picture, I'm very skinny, I'm very scrawny. Went from somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 kilos, so I think it was slightly above 80 kilos, down all the way to, I believe it's 64 kilos, maybe even slightly lower at my lowest, which might have been like 61 or yeah, 60, somewhere around that number. It wasn't until I started training, strength training, in the form of calisthenics, that I started building some muscle. I started eating some more, but it's still very whole based approach. And then from there, anytime my body fat made a reversal from being relatively lean, so I'm speaking, I think the lowest was around 9% or 10%, and then shooting up. Let's say as a metric that between from 12% downwards, you're in the lean category. Yeah. Then it started shooting up between 12 to 15 quite heavily, because of things that I wasn't doing right. So I was either compromising my sleep, or I was, well, which generally came from going out and partying, which meant drinking and drinking a lot, or just being stressed, right? That played a pretty big role in it as well. Other things that seemed to have an impact was obviously the food that I was eating. If I was strict with, and I didn't even have that notion or idea about bio-individuality, so I just figured, oh, like what I was eating was healthy. But I've been through periods where intuitively I would go into more foods that didn't seem to bother my digestive system or my gut that much, and then the effects or the results were always the same, which was me getting leaner. So whenever I was going off track, my body fat went up. You can see that I'm softer, I'm retaining more water, right? So which could be higher estrogen, lower testosterone, right? So that the stress also does affect your water. And every time that I kind of reiterated this process, it was the same, where I would shoot up to around 15%, maybe slightly higher, or sometimes it just looks higher because of the water retention making you look so soft and flat, and then getting stricter again, which would dive it back down to 12. And it really wasn't until I started going animal based, so starting with carnivore, that like fat came off of me very effortlessly, and I started building muscle even when I was injured, because I started carnivore. I think it was 2 years after, or a year and a half after injuring my shoulder with a partial shoulder dislocation with a weight, with a load. So that took me out of the game completely, which made me gain fat again, and of course the stress from the injury added to the fat gain. But then when I got on carnivore and I noticed that my gut started improving, and even if I was probably functioning at around 60% of my capacity, I was still relatively weak. Then I was still gaining muscle and then just getting leaner. So that's where this entire thing of bio-individuality makes so much sense, or rather, it's so important, because I can relate it to my journey. I'm sure that other people can too. Whenever I started going into foods that I don't have any adverse gut reactions to, my physique would reflect that. Meaning that like muscle would come on, not necessarily like super easily, but if I was training hard, I would be gaining muscle and losing fat. Whereas if I was training hard, but my nutrition was poor, or I was having a lot of things that I'm intolerant to, then I wasn't building much muscle at all, and I definitely wasn't losing any fat. So despite the fact that I trained really hard and a lot, whether that was like a few hours of strength training, whatever it was, lifting, weighted calisthenics, all of the above, and even Krav Maga on top of that, teaching for 3 hours and training for 1.5 to 2 hours, like it barely made a dent in my fat gain and sorry, muscle gain and fat loss. So that's whenever the nutrition was dialed in. However, that's when things started falling into place. So that's my journey, and you can see through these different pictures how much my body has changed over the years, and how much it changes, or how fast it can change once you're following a nutrition protocol that's coherent to your bio-individuality. So I hope you guys learned some things, and that these insights are helpful. If they are, let me know in the comments. And yeah, wish you all the best of luck with your journey of getting healthier and gaining muscle and losing fat.